Now, following a letter written by the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, Netherlands, and Germany to their diplomats, the Department of International Cooperation, DIRCO, held a meeting with the diplomatic representatives of those 5 countries to raise concerns about the matter yesterday. Now, according to DIRCO, the contents of the letter, which urged President Cyril Ramaphosa to deal with corruption in the country, is not of concern to the department. However, the way in which the communique was presented was not according to protocol. Now, talking to us from Pretoria this morning is Ottilia Maunganidze, who is a legal analyst and international criminal law expert from the Institute of Security Studies, or ISS. And here in our Joburg studios with me is Busi Mavuso, the COO of Business Leadership South Africa, or BLSA. Ladies, thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you for having us.
So let's just start with the 2 issues that are very clearly underlined. The one is the matter of protocol, and the other is the contents of the particular communique. Let's start with protocol, and I'm going to start with you, Ottilia. With regard to what has happened here, and as far as we can ascertain with regard to what has happened here, what do you make of the protocol issues? How should it be done, and was it breached in this instance?
Right. In this instance, it seems there was quite a case of miscommunication, not least in that the Sunday papers then reported on it as if the communication was something that was sent to the presidency recently. Now, what we've learned over the past 12 or so hours is, in fact, that the communication is something from June last year that the embassies themselves had transmitted through ahead of the investment conference, and so in many ways in line with what the issues at the time that were being discussed. Now, from DIRCO's side, understandably, because they read this about this in the Sunday papers, their presumption then was that the embassies communicated directly with the presidency in this year, and at no point did they do that through DIRCO. Now, normal practice would be that embassies, even though they represent their foreign missions, unless it's an issue related to national or state security, that they would transmit that information through DIRCO. So from the department's point of view, until the facts were clarified, they were right to be concerned that communication was going directly to the presidency. But what we've learned now is that protocol was indeed followed, and that the Sunday papers were reporting on 6-month-old news, if I can put it that way.
Now, when you say protocol was indeed followed, it would seem as though that communication was given to the envoy, one of the envoys appointed by President Cyril Ramaphosa, and you say that is pretty much in line with what protocol dictates.
In this instance, yes.
So from your side as BLSA, what did you make of this whole situation, Busi?
So I think I agree with the protocol issues. I don't know much about that, but I think in as far as the contents of the letter is concerned, Sakina, I think they were right to raise the concerns that they've raised. If you look at the situation and say these are the countries that are responsible for 75% of foreign direct investment in this country, we are busy at the moment as a country going around the world trying to attract foreign direct investment to the tune of 1.2 trillion. The likelihood is that that 1.2 trillion, the majority thereof is going to come from those that are already invested here, because they've got a certain level of confidence in the country. They know how to work with the country, and so on and so on. So if they feel in any way that their investment is at risk, if they feel that their investment, is not protected, then they've got the right to raise those issues. But put that aside, the issue of corruption, irrespective of what the world powers are saying, we are sitting with this quagmire as a country where we are at the brink of collapse as a country precisely because of this corruption. We are seeing the ANC government not wanting to take stern and decisive action in as far as corruption is concerned. So I don't see why we have to have world powers, actually raising this, to us. We should actually be doing the right thing. We have sitting ministers that are currently implicated in corruption and we have done nothing. So I think we're going to have to decide as a country that do we want to continue to play in this sea of mediocrity, or do we want to actually be decisive and take the decisions that are right for the country. We are sitting with the ESCOM that is sitting at 400 billion rands debt. This is an albatross around South Africa in snacks, and we are going to SONA now. We have to come up with a plan in terms of how we are going to deal with this issue. We are sitting with 37% unemployment. We're sitting with 53% poverty. We're sitting with 13.8 million people that are living in abject poverty, and that number has grown from 11 million between 2011 and 2015. All of this as a direct of this very same corruption. All of this as a direct of money that has been siphoned out of this country. So the issue of corruption, I think, is spot on. It's not about what the international people are saying, but we as a country need to be putting the same pressure on the ANC to say you are going to have to be decisive and something is going to have to give. A litigation or two is going to have to come from this.
You've said quite a lot, and so much of which I would love to unpack further. Let's start here.
Yeah.
You say these countries are concerned about their investments.
Absolutely.
What do you mean by that? What exactly are they concerned about? Are their investments, in fact, at risk?
So if you're going to go to a bank and borrow money, Sakina, the bank has to satisfy themselves of your ability to repay that money. So if this money is going to be used for corrupt activities, if you are sitting with the exposure of 670 billion as a country, if you are confronted with a situation where you have to pay 170 billion just on interest alone, if you're sitting with the ESCOM that is on the brink of collapse, if you're sitting with SOEs that have been hollowed out, if you're sitting with SOEs that are dysfunctional and are therefore putting the country and the sovereign at risk, if you are sitting in a position where you could just be another failed African state, it means that the investment that we have as a country, the chances of your repaying that money are actually slim. So if I therefore as an investor raise a concern to say that if you don't get hold of corruption, if you don't be exemplary, about those that have been directly implicated in corruption by ensuring that they go to jail so that you discourage whoever else is thinking about doing it, then, I'm well within my rights to be raising those to say that, are you using the money that I've borrowed you for the intents and purposes for which you are supposed to raise it? Because therefore, if you don't, chances of you repairing it are actually slim. So they are actually spot on. They should be raising it. Actually, there should be more noise coming out, towards corruption.
Ottilia, what's your view on this, given that there is a school of thought that came through very strongly in the aftermath of this particular report that says that this is possibly just another attempt by some of the world's superpowers to control the narrative once again in South Africa and make sure that they get government to do what they want. What's your thought on this?
Well, in line in many ways with what Busi has already said, it's not that the issues around corruption have not been raised domestically by voters, by other political parties, but also by the governing party itself, that this is something that needs to be addressed. I think even notably, the former president, Thabo Mbeki, was heading an initiative around illicit financial flows that lends itself to the fact that if we are unable to retain whatever income that we get within Africa, legally that is, then our development imperatives and all the things that we want to be able to do with that income won't happen. So it's not so much that the 5 missions or the 5 countries in this instance were raising something that we currently in the public discussions around what is going on in South Africa that we are currently not having right now. And I think since that letter from last year was sent, we have the Zondo Commission at the moment that is currently sitting and looking at instances of state capture. We've got the commission into the PIC that is also looking at abuses at the PIC. We've got the Mahoro Commission that is looking at the eligibility of 2 senior advocates in the NPA and also looking at some of the concerns that were raised there around the National Prosecuting Authority and its functioning. So these are things that we are already dealing with as a country, and these are things that we need to address. And I think right now the conversation we need to be having, which is an honest and frank conversation, an internal discussion, is how do we deal with the issues around corruption, misgovernance, in a way that actually benefits us. And if other people can see it, then we ought to be concerned.
Now, you talk about having honest conversations, and an authentic conversation is one that also speaks to the private sector. Busi, you the COO of Business Leadership South Africa, and what culpability should the private sector be taking with regard to where the SOEs that you speak about find themselves in today? Because they were part and parcel of this process of eroding the public sector.
Sakina, the private sector is not innocent in all of this. We have Steinhoff, we have KPMG, we have Bain, which ensured that SARS, which used to be our national pride, is now a dysfunctional organization. And I think we have been first as BLSA to say that these organizations, we have first and foremost suspended them, and we have been first to say that, to speak against that corruption. But I think when it comes to state funds, I think the problem is that we're dealing with public goods. The problem is that we're dealing with your and my taxes. The problem is that we're dealing with money that is supposed to go for fiscal spending, money that is supposed to go towards education, towards eradicating poverty, towards health, towards schooling, towards housing, you name it. The state capture project alone has costed this country 100 billion rands. And I think we are yet to get the correct figure, because my view is that the private
sector is heavily implicated in this. You've got the companies that you've mentioned, and they are but the tip of the iceberg. Dennis Bloom last week in his testimony at the State Capture Commission said it's not just Bosasa. There are many others that we are not talking about right now. So you look at the likes of Bosasa, you look at the likes of McKinsey, some companies that nobody ever thought, would surface in this particular light, and they have. So what is the role and responsibility? What sort of culpability needs to be attached to the private sector in this regard? Because yes, you have people and actors within the state who are actively eroding, but they are doing this with the tacit approval and help, benefit accruing to the private sector at the same time. So what culpability should the private sector take?
Sakina, when I started earlier on, I said the ANC is going to have to stop playing in the sea of mediocrity and take decisive action. And
but I'm not talking about the ANC.
Listen, that decisive action includes ensuring that those that are implicated in this, including the private sector, by the way. So if Agrizi and Busasa and whoever, their cronies, were actually the corruptors and the government the corruptees, we now have evidence that they've been giving these people money, every month, 300,000. So together with Novula Mukonyane and Zuma, Agrizi and the Busasa executives are going to have to go to jail. So this is where I'm saying that we now have the evidence in front of us. Why is there no litigation? So this is the frustration from us as private sector as well, to say that the only thing that we can do as BLSA is to jump up and down and talk, very strongly against this. But until the NPA takes action, we can't really arrest these people now, can we?
Is that I think it is a given at this stage that the government actors will be dealt with as they are named, or at least we hope they will. However, so the politicians, I'll come to you in a sec. That is one side of the story. But what are you doing as BLSA about the private sector actors?
So we have suspended them into our midst. So we refuse to continue to have these organizations, as members of BLSA.
Who you suspended?
So we've suspended Bain, we suspended KPMG, we suspended ESCOM. Steinhoff was not a member of BLSA, so we could not suspend them. And those, McKinsey was not a member of BLSA. But I think you would remember
McKinsey and his companies, have you suspended them?
Those that have been members of BLSA, SAP was not member of BLSA, but remember, it was the BLSA who first called for McKinsey to pay the interest to ESCOM on that 1 billion rands that they had to, even though McKinsey was not a member of BLSA. Bonang and I, my CEO, had a lot of conversations and meetings with the leadership of McKinsey to say that how are you going to correct the wrongs that you have actually. So even when these companies that have been found wanting have not been members of BLSA, but precisely for the fact that they've been in the private private sector. We know that, therefore, as the BLSA, we're going to have to stand up and not be found to be two-faced, to only be talking about corruption when it happens in SOEs. We actually have to talk about it in the private sector as well. And we have been very unequivocal, you know, and been very unapologetic by calling those companies out and actually calling on the JSE to say that if it means that you scrap these people off the roll, then do so, you know. But unfortunately, all we can do is to make this noise. The powers that be are going to have to actually take action, and that is what our frustration is.
Ottilia?
I think when we're speaking about corruption, I do think we have a tendency to focus almost singularly on the state because like what you've said, Sakina, as well as Busi, because we think about the state as the one that holds the public purse, and therefore if any funds that the state in whatever way misappropriates, those funds affect you and I directly. We often forget that corruption is a two-way street. And Sakina, you've pointed to the fact of the need for business to be held more accountable, more responsible for their complicity, because I think even when we speak about state capture as a concept, we're implying that there is a state that can be captured, and we're implying that there are people outside of the state that can do that capturing. To have a conversation that suggests, for example, that the weight of responsibility should be more on government, or even to say that it should be more on the private sector, takes away that balance. It's a two-way street, it's a two-way relationship. The state, as much as the private sector, ought to be held to account. We know that now, you know, in our free and democratic South Africa that we have, that we come from a system before this, which was grand-scale corruption at its greatest order. There has been lots that has been said, there's been lots that has been written about the way that the apartheid state was structured in a way that lent itself to a controlled state, or a state that is at the behest of the private sector. We can't have that. We can't have a situation where the state is not within the control of the state, and we can't have a situation where the private sector is not held to account, even where that corruption does not relate to the state. So even where, for example, like the Steinhoff scandal that we still are reeling from, and we learn, for example, the link there with issues around the pensions fund, for example, all corruption needs to be dealt with, whether it's just in the private sector or just in the public sector. It has to be dealt with.
And I think the dilemma now facing us as a nation is, of course, we have all these commissions of inquiry.
Yes.
And before them, there were many others, you know, many other fact-finding commissions that has cost this country billions of rands, and no follow-up, no follow-through. So how do we now ensure that there's a different outcome this time around? Let's start with you, Busi.
I think we have absolute faith in the current NPA head that has just been appointed to say that they are going to take whatever evidence that is coming out of this commission and make sure that we get a litigation or two, because I think that is going to send a very strong message, you know, to your point, private sector and public sector alike, to say that corruption is not going to be tolerated, to say that corruption comes at a very high cost to the South African society, whether in the form of public goods or in the form of having foreign direct investors who now don't want to invest in this country precisely because, you know, there being no action taken against such deeds, you know, precisely because so much money has been siphoned out of the country, and therefore a lot of people who are actually deserving, you know, of schools, healthcare facilities and so forth are now going to have to be robbed out of that because we refuse to act, and these people are just left to be, as it were.
And of course, just pulling it back to where this conversation started with the communique that was sent by these 5 countries. Ottilia, for their part, I mean, we talk about, you know, the flight of funds out of this continent, not just this country. Some of it, we are told, have gone to some of these countries mentioned on this list. So what sort of role ought they to be playing in that regard?
Indeed, and I'll go back to my earlier point around ensuring that responsibility isn't just for, I don't know, the person or the entity that's currently out of favor, but it has to be across the board. And I think particularly the flip side of being the major investors in South Africa is that also there's a greater responsibility on the part of those 5 countries and other countries as well to ensure that the businesses that come from their countries and that operate within South Africa, within the continent, also meet set standards. I mentioned earlier, for example, Steinhoff, and we know the controversy around that specific entity, and that it's a multinational company that also does quite a significant amount of business in Europe, for example. And I think in calling for accountability in South Africa, we ought to also be calling for accountability across the board. But if I can just add one small thing, Sakina, right at the end now, is when we speak about accountability, it's not enough for us to say, for example, the head of such and such a company or the head of a department that was implicated in corruption has been held to account. We have to recognize that corruption exists and operates as part of a system, which means there's a lot that needs to happen even for you or myself when you get stopped by the police. Recently, there was a City of Tshwane metropolitan police person who was found guilty for taking a 10 Rand bribe. A lot of people said, but that's too little. The fact of the matter is, no matter whether it's 10 Rand or a trillion, if we are able to have an institutional, systemic approach to dealing with corruption that makes it such that small people and big people don't commit it, that's the way to go. And I agree with Busi, having a new National Director for Public Prosecutions coming from the International Criminal Court, but also having operated at domestic level, we hope, and I say we hope because it can never be certain, we hope then that the NPA takes up these cases, not just for the big fish, but also for people who are doing the low-level type of corruption that we see every day.
Well, I wish we could go on, but we can't. But thank you so much to our guest, Ottilia Maunganidze, who is a legal analyst and international criminal law expert from the Institute for Security Studies, and Busi Mavuso, the COO of Business Leadership South Africa, for talking to us about the letter that was written to the presidency by 5 nations urging President Cyril Ramaphosa to deal with corruption in South Africa. And with that, it brings us up to news.